Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here, and welcome to Fixing It in the Mix, Part 3. All right, so in today's video, we're gonna dive back into an old mix of mine where I'm gonna go back and fix the drum mix with two simple techniques. So without any further ado, let's check out the audio sample, pay close attention to the drums, and then I'm gonna dissect and show you how I go about fixing this drum mix. So that sample is by my good friends in a band called Discord. I worked with them back in 2014, and to be honest with you, I'm actually still very happy with this mix. I really love the guitar tone, great vocal performances, drum performances, just a great solid deathcore band all around, or maybe I should say melodic death metal band. My gripe with the mix, and this is all my own doing listening back, was that the drums sound very kind of like too close and up front, and I'm using natural toms in this production, which can be challenging with technical music. And I noticed that when he rolls around the kit, the toms are not present enough, and sometimes they ring out too much. Now, it's not as simple as just going in there and boosting top end or using a gate. I want to reshape the transients of the toms. And also, I want to add a nice natural ambience around the drum kit. But here's the problem. If we look at the track count here, I have a few of my tom tracks, my kick samples, snare samples, and just two overhead tracks. Now, back then I knew better. I knew to close mic all of my cymbals and also to use room mics. And for whatever reason on this production, I did not use any room mics. I always recommend to stick up at least one mono room mic, even if you're recording within a small room. A room mic can really help glue the sound of your kit together, and that's exactly what I'm missing here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna figure out a way to still add that ambience around the kit without even having a room mic to use in the mix. And it's one of my favorite drum mixing tricks that I utilize whenever I have to mix tracks where there's no room mic in the session. So let's actually listen to these drums in solo before we dive in and add or take away anything. Let's check it out. So it's nice and punchy, nice punchy snare. But again, the drums are just too up front. And now I have reverb on the actual individual drums, but if you've been mixing for any length of time, I'm sure you know by now that just adding reverb to your direct mics rarely works. It's a great supplement to your drum sound, but it's not gonna fake a room sound. You have to have a room mic set up or maybe use the trick that I'm gonna share with you here. So let's tackle that issue first before we get to the toms. Let's make a fake room around our drums that sounds realistic. Now, like I said, I only have two overheads in this track, and if we look here, the way I had them EQ'd is pretty extreme. I'm rolling off all frequencies below around 900 Hertz, pulling out some of the harsh mid-range, and just allowing the overheads to exist in the top end. Because my goal, especially with like super aggressive music like this, is to just have the overheads be cymbal mics. Generally, the sound of your kick and snare and toms and your overheads is not gonna be that pleasing for this genre of music. I'm not saying all of the time, but I found that most of the time you want as little drums and room spill in your overheads as possible. Now, if I'm working with indie rock or even like a rock band, this could be a different story. Sometimes I want a nice smack of the snare in the overheads. But my goal here when I recorded these drums was to eliminate as much drums in the overheads as possible. Now, most of the reason why you're not hearing drums in the overheads comes down to two different reasons. One, I close mic the cymbals. So even though it's just a stereo pair of overheads here, I'm still miking the cymbals nice and close. And also the cymbals are so heavily filtered. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna bypass the processing on these overheads. And I want you to listen to how much drums is still in these mics before the microphones hit the EQs and the filters. Let's check it out. Now, as far as an overhead sound, I really don't want that snare and that kick drum and all that stuff like I previously mentioned. I just want cymbals. So the sound I'm left with is this. So as you can hear, you mainly hear cymbals, maybe a little bit of snare, but within the context of the drum mix, all you're really hearing from these tracks are cymbals. So now, here's the trick. I'm gonna utilize these tracks and I'm gonna fake a room sound. And the way I do this is so simple. I'm gonna go to my drum mix here, and I'm gonna create a new stereo audio track. And now I'm going to drag these two overhead tracks to this new track. So I'm not deleting any tracks, I'm actually duplicating my overheads. And I'm gonna name this track, in quotes, Rooms. So let's just listen to the Rooms track and make sure that my overheads are coming through. And it looks like it's working. So now, my next step here is going to be to get rid of the low end I don't need and the top end that I don't need. So in a way, I'm kind of creating a crossover in that my cymbal tracks are gonna be the high frequency content of this source, and my Rooms tracks, or track, is going to be the mid-range of the source tracks. So again, I'm gonna just roll off all frequencies below 350 Hertz, and I'm gonna get rid of all of the top end here, rolling off all frequencies, everything above 4.5K. And let's hear what we're left with. So as you can hear, that's not really adding much to our drum sound. If anything right now, it's actually kind of hurting our drum sound. One thing I'm noticing, because I'm focusing the tracks in the mid-range, I hear too much snare poking through. And again, remember, I'm still close miking my cymbals. If I were using a traditional pair of overheads in this mix, there'd be way too much snare drum in these overheads. So I wanna kind of eliminate some of the snare that's poking through. I'm just gonna use a basic compressor with a semi-high ratio just to really kill some transient on the snare. Let's dial that in. So now I have a smoother source sound. You still hear the snare, you hear the toms, you hear a little bit of the kick, but a lot of that transient on the snare is being lopped off, which is what I want. But even still, I'm gonna take it a step further. To make my rooms sound bigger, I'm going to add a reverb to this track. Nothing extreme, just a simple room reverb with a stock plugin in my DAW to fake the size of this room. Now this is different than adding reverb to your snare track or tom tracks, because the reverb is being applied to a microphone that's a little more distant from the direct mics on the drums. Remember, these are the overhead tracks, which are at least 3 feet away from the toms and maybe even 4 feet away or 3 feet away from the snare drum. So it's still a secondary sound source, almost like a room mic. Now, okay, I have a stock reverb plugin here. I'm gonna set it to a room setting. I'm gonna make it 100% wet. That's the trick here. I prefer to keep it 100% wet because I want none of that direct sound. I want this to sound like a room mic, or actually a stereo pair of room mics. And let's hear how this is sounding. Okay, it's still sounding a little too big. I'm gonna shorten the decay. Maybe I'll use a small room setting. Now I have a feeling that once this is blended into the drum mix, it's gonna sound pretty realistic. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna solo my drums, and I'm gonna bring my rooms track all the way at 0, and I'm gonna slowly bring it up to where it's adding a nice ambience to my drums that sounds like an actual stereo room track blended in with my drum mix. All of a sudden, it sounds like my drums were recorded in a bigger room. And again, this creates a much different result than just sticking reverb on the individual tracks or even using a reverb send. All I did, again, once more to be ultra clear, was duplicate my overhead tracks. So these guys right here, I duplicated them to a completely different track or a stereo track, and I treated it and EQ'd it in a different way. So my overheads are focusing on the top end of this sound source, and the room tracks are focusing only on the mid-range, and they're being sent through a reverb that's set 100% wet. Again, I use this a lot on tracks that people send me that don't have room mics, because for me, most of the time, if you don't have room mics in the mix, the drums just sound weirdly dry and too close and just unnatural. Because when you think of a drum set in a room, your ear is not next to the snare drum, your ear is not next to the toms or kick. You're hearing the drum set as a unified instrument. Now, the next problem we have to tackle here is adding attack to those toms. Remember, this is very technical music, a lot of busy rolls, and we want to bring out those toms, but I don't want them to sound brighter. I don't want to boost top end. To me, they already sound bright enough. And I also want to kill some of the sustain. So in order to accomplish this, it's so simple. I'm going to just use a simple transient shaper. And right here, I'm using the Metric Halo transient control. I'm going to pull up one of my presets that I call aggressive toms. I'm just increasing transient and reducing sustain. Now, if you're a Reaper user, I know Reaper has a great transient shaper stock within the DAW for free. I'm using Pro Tools, which does not, which is why I'm using a third-party transient shaper. So again, my goal with the transient shaper is to increase the initial transient and reduce sustain. And the thing is, a transient shaper affects the source sounds in a slightly different way than a compressor. In my opinion, it does it in a much more natural way that sounds different than a compressor. For the most part, a compressor will add character to a sound, where to my ears, a transient shaper does it in a way, again, that you don't even notice. It just makes the sound source have more attack, as if the source had more attack in the first place. I'm gonna play right around here where he's playing busy fills throughout the intro of the song without the transient shapers engaged, and then I'll play it a second time with them engaged, and listen to how much of a difference it makes. So that was without, and this is with. So as you can hear, now the toms are jumping through, and also a lot of the excess sustain on the toms was reduced in a way that sounds very natural and only took using a single plugin. So there you have it. This is how I went back and fixed this drum mix that, again, this is a pretty solid mix. I'm still happy with it. Again, I really love the guitar tone, just great musicianship overall. I just felt that the drums were a little too close and up front and a little too dry, and I wanted them to sound more like an actual drum kit in a room, while still being able to hear the toms cutting through without them sounding overly sample replaced or like a drum machine. So tell me, I would love to know, do you have issues with mixing drums? And if you do, let me know what those issues are. Leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'd love to hear your opinion. Now, if you're looking to improve the sound of your mixes, the truth is the best way to get good at mixing is to mix a high volume of different music. Not the same song over and over and over and over and over again, which unfortunately happens to many of us as home studio mixers. We mix the same music, the same songs for months on end, and we completely lose perspective, and it stunts our growth as producers. And this is why next week I'll be opening the doors to the Frightbox MixCrypt community. In the Frightbox MixCrypt, we mix a brand new song every single month. All members have access to all of the multi-tracks for the songs, and you also get an in-depth masterclass of my mix of each of the songs every single month. Again, a brand new song, multi-track download, and masterclass at the start of every month. And you also have access to our supportive community made up of like-minded musicians and producers. In the community, we help each other out, critique each other's mixes, and at the end of each month, there's a live group coaching call with me, live and in real time, where you could ask me questions in our community. If this sounds interesting to you, click the link below and join the Frightbox MixCrypt waitlist. The doors will be opening up next week, and I only open the doors to this community once or twice throughout the entire year, so you're not gonna wanna miss this opportunity. And until next time, happy mixing.